I now invite Sri Abhishek Agarwal to make his presentation.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the valuable insights, from our esteemed panelists. Uh, so while we are talking about MSME in context with different industries, I mean, I will stick myself basically uh, to the topic of the discussion today, that how do we enable the MSMEs, for the global value chains. Um, so what's happening, and Mr. Chedda actually brought in, some good points to the light. But what's happening eventually is that due to this pandemic, right, there are a lot of things which are happening in the background. So the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy, it has severely basically disrupted the global value chains, across all the countries. And I mean, I would say that just from the number perspective, that two-third, I mean, these global value chains, basically they account for two-third, or basically the four-fifth, almost like 80% of the global trade. So how do we enable our SMEs, especially to get linked to these global value chains? So what has happened, that this COVID pandemic not only disrupted these global value chains, but there is a very adverse impact on the demand and supply chain for MSMEs, especially in India, and that too on the very regional basis. So what's happening in lieu of that? That this is prompting a lot of global value chains led investments for relocation to the developing countries like India, because of the disruption happening all across the world. So India is actually at a spot wherein a lot of countries are looking for investment and putting their money in India. So that's like a silver lining as to how India is being looked upon to be added to these global value chains. Just from the number perspective, most of the countries, especially in the developing world, export SMEs in developing countries account for 8% of the total manufacturing sales. So there's a lot of scope. Idea is, I mean, how do we really relate and enable our companies, our industry, especially in India, to be linked to the global value chains? Uh, so there are multiple ways, and a couple of them being brought by our esteemed panelists in the background earlier today. Uh, Technology adoption is definitely the biggest, and I would say the first methodology that we can use to go for enabling our SMEs to be added to the global value chain. We are talking about different industries here: manufacturing, be it agriculture, retail, services, and all of these are part of MSMEs. The idea is how technology can really cut through. So while there was, I would say, in the beginning, Mr. Sharma, he talked about the problems that generally these MSMEs they are facing for the technology adoption. But the reality is, if you look at the stats, and again, this is a survey done by FICCI India, that 60% of these MSMEs they have computers and the internet connection at their, at their campus. So while companies may be small or big, but they have that, ability or the infrastructure in place, at least 60 to 70% of them to be linked to the technology through computers and internet. So once we have that in place, the technology adoption becomes really, easier. While there is still a room for 30%, and our total GDP, I would say, so these MSMEs, I mean, they come for almost like 50% of the exports that we are doing. But the adoption of the technology, the room for technology is still not that big right now for these companies to adopt upon. I will talk about, let's say, IoT, AI, machine learning. These are different terms that may not be applicable to all the industries, but the adoption is already there at a bigger level, especially for the companies wherein, the computer access and the internet access is there. So the path has already been open as far as the remote monitoring and control, the autonomous systems, all these things are concerned for the technology adoption. And this is basically on ground reality. And I'm not, generalizing my statement here. I'm not saying it is for everyone, but definitely for 60 to 65% of our, I would say, industry in this sector, in multiple sectors. Now, the other way is basically, the major way to link to the global value chains is through the e-commerce. While at a very broad level, Mr. Chadda and Mr. Sharma, they spoke about it, but the idea is how do we really link to the e-commerce, So and e-commerce is the fulcrum wherein the entire money actually rotates. So India's MSME cater to the business to consumer, basically retail sector, primarily at a domestic level, where the domestic consumer widely influences demand and supply chain management. The cross-border e-commerce has given an opportunity to the Indian MSMEs to cater to a larger market, which is close to USD $50 billion, B2B market. And basically this has given us the access to engage with the international consumers directly. Um, um, our export, basically overall export so far till December, I have the numbers. It was close to around like 350 billion US dollars between April to December 2020. And while the global, retail e-commerce is expected, the e-commerce business is expected to reach around 4.9 trillion by the end of this year. I'm talking about January to December. So look at the gap. We are talking about 4.9 trillion of e-commerce trade, and while our overall export is close to like half a trillion. So I would say a huge gap or a huge potential. Let me put it like this: it's a huge potential that we can look for, as far as the growth of our SMEs and enabling them to really catch upon for some business from the international market. As I was telling that 60 to 70% of the surveyed workforce across various MSMEs, they have the employed, computers and the internet connection. So that is a big boost for our industry in terms of linkage to e-commerce directly. Now, idea is that how do we leverage? I mean, what are the opportunities to leverage and in this e-commerce market and basically help our SMEs to thrive? So um, I was, doing some analysis, and it came to my attention that nearly 40%, 43% of India's exports are limited to Asia and thereafter to Europe and America. So what's happening is that while we are limited to Asia for multiple good and bad reasons, there is a big opportunity. I just talked about like $4.9 trillion of global trade for India to look for the countries beyond Asia. If you look at the hierarchy or the stacking, it's basically Asia and then basically Europe and America, while America basically brings a lot of, I would say, value in terms of the global trade for different countries in the world. So global e-commerce transactions, if you look at the numbers in the year, they hit actually, as I said, around 4.2 to 4.5 trillion dollars, which is actually a 25% year-on-year jump, in the global web sales. So idea is our linkage to internet and thereafter to the e-commerce, basically B2B or B2C models, can actually help any industry, down on ground to really thrive and make some good business, out of this linkage. Again, associating ourselves to the global value chains, the topic that we are discussing around. That means the online share of the total retail sales, it has actually crossed 20%, with e-commerce accounting for all the retail growth and gains in online sector. So I will basically, I will conclude, I mean, with 2 points. One is while there is a lot of adoption there in reality, I mean, and I understand some companies may not be up to the speed, but the reality is that we are actually increasing our business 20% year on year, especially for e-commerce. And there are a lot of government funded schemes. We can talk about in detail separately, but government is really pushing back in India. I mean, idea is how can we leverage those different schemes, whether it was like I would say this rupees 3 lakh crore EC LGS scheme, which is one of the key components in 20 lakh crore economic stimulus package that was announced last May during the COVID situation, or basically 20,000 crores as a subordinate debt to provide equity support to stress MSMEs. So government support is there. Idea is how can we leverage it? What is the knowledge around it? And people are really aware of that or not is again a question mark. So with that, I would like to conclude from my side. Thank you, everyone.